Thank you so much for having me here today. It's actually one of the great joys of writing this book is getting to visit and be a part of other Chinese communities all across North America. So thank you so much for hosting me here tonight. So I'm going to do a little bit of an abbreviated overview of Anna May Wong's life and career. And if I go over time, just tell me to hurry up. But I think we'll be good. So let's get started. So who was Anna May Wong? So she was born Wong Liu Song in 1905 in Los Angeles. Her Chinese name translates loosely to frosted yellow willows. She was the daughter of a laundryman, and both of her parents were actually born in Northern California. So it was her grandparents who had immigrated from China to the US around the time of the gold rush, which, you can count generations differently. I would consider her third generation Chinese American. She's also the first American-born actor of Asian ancestry to play a leading role in a Hollywood production. Across her 4-decade career, she basically worked in every single medium. She started in silence, transitioned to talkies, did radio, theater, and television in the 1950s. And so, of course, across her career, working in all those mediums, she accomplished many firsts. So where does it all begin for Anna May Wong? Well, you have to talk about the laundry, her family's business in downtown Los Angeles. This is a photograph of the Wong clan circa 1925. Anna May is the girl in the back right corner. She's standing behind her father, Wong Sam-sing. And in the far left corner is her oldest sister, Lulu. So she and Lulu were very close. They're about 2 years apart. Spent a lot of their formative years together. And as children of a working class family that had a small business, whenever they weren't at school, they were at home helping out with the business. So from a very early age, the two girls could be seen, toting around packages of clean laundry that they would deliver to customers around Los Angeles. And around this time in their childhood was the same time that movie studios in the East Coast of the US, in New York and New Jersey, started moving out to Los Angeles because they'd realized that they could shoot films all year round with all the sunshine. So little Anna May is noticing these film crews that are just showing up in the streets of downtown Los Angeles and in Chinatown, because Chinatown is essentially free atmosphere. They don't have to build a set. They can just show up and start filming. And she's intensely curious about what's going on here. As by some accounts, she becomes known among these movie people as the curious Chinese child, because she's always there at the sidelines asking questions or just watching. And pretty soon she starts skipping school, saving her lunch money or the tips that she gets from delivering laundry to go to the movies and watching reels play from end to end, and then racing home to reenact the scenes she's just witnessed. So, the laundry in some ways became a conduit to her movie career. And that continues as she starts to get her foot in the door. So by age 11, she's already decided that she's going to be a movie star. She's seeing this going on all around town. And one of her first roles is an uncredited extra in a film called The Red Lantern that's set in China around the Boxer Rebellion, and starring Alla Nazimova, who was a huge star at the time. And so she's just an extra. She's a lantern bearer. And she actually saves up her lunch money for a week to take all of her friends with her to the movies to see her big debut. And her friends ask her, "So which one is you?" And she doesn't know. She just says, "I think the second one carrying the lantern is me," but she doesn't actually know. So that's her first brush with the movies. Doesn't deter her at all. And pretty soon she's getting bit parts, credited roles, small supporting parts. So here in this article from the Los Angeles Times in 1921 is one of her first interviews that she gives after, I think, probably being in Dinty, which is also pictured here, her at age 15 in that role. But one of the really interesting things about these early interviews is that, the reporters don't really know what to make of this young woman. It's at a time in American history when people don't really know what it means to be Chinese American, to be a hyphenated American. They assume that if you're Chinese, you must be from China. You weren't born here. So you can see from the headline on the article, Maid of Orient, unspoiled by success, dips her ivory hands in suds. So on the one hand, they're really impressed with this young actress who's also working at her father's laundry. But they're projecting this image onto her of being a Chinese maiden out of a book of poems. Except that when they start talking to her, they realize that she's like any other young woman of her age. She's a flapper. She speaks in the local jargon. So there's one quote, actually, that's the epigraph to my book that talks about all this imagery, what they're thinking about Anna May Wong, and then she opens her mouth and ruins it all. So there's this dissonant thing they couldn't understand. How could she be so fluent in this culture and yet look like that? So that happens to her again and again, and she really embraces the flapper image in her early career. As you can see in the photograph at the far right, she's dressed like a flapper with her cloche hat, her dress with the skirt at the knees, her Mary Janes. So two early films are really important in her career. The first of which is The Toll of the Sea in 1922, which is actually the second Technicolor film ever made. And it cast her in her first leading role at the age of 17. And the reason that this could even happen is because Technicolor scientists were making this film in collaboration with the Hollywood studio. And the whole purpose of the film was to demonstrate their color technology. So they decided upon a Chinese story. They took a Madame Butterfly tale and moved it from Japan and set it in China because they wanted to make use of these lush backdrops with really rich, brightly colored costumes, antiques, all sorts of things. And the other part of that too was that they wanted the color to appear natural, authentic. So they're actually casting Asian actors in Asian roles, unlike most Hollywood studios at the time that were casting white actors in yellowface. The other part of this film that's interesting is that because it's being made by Technicolor, it's essentially a demonstration film. It's not meant to be high art or anything like that. Also, the Madame Butterfly tale has been told a million times, even by 1922. Mary Pickford has done it, Norma Talmadge has done it. No one's expecting anything interesting from this. But Anna May Wong, she sees this as her big opportunity. So she gives a virtuoso performance, is able to cry real tears on cue in front of the camera without the aid of glycerin or fake tears. And she just blows all the critics away. The New York Times reviewer watches this film and says, 9 times out of 10, this performance is botched, but hers is the 10th performance. So imagine getting a review like that from the New York Times at 17. Of course, this film, gets her notice in Hollywood. And one of the people who sees it is Douglas Fairbanks. He's one of the biggest stars in the world at that point, also has his own production company. He's just about to cast for his next big blockbuster, which is an Arabian Nights tale set, it's called The Thief of Bagdad, and he's looking for exotic types. And he sees Anna May Wong in this film, he sees her talent, and he decides to cast her as the Mongol slave, which you can see here. She's very scantily clad. But this actually ends up becoming her unlikely breakout role. And because the film is shown around the world, it launches her to international stardom. She becomes a name in Hollywood. So I'm going to play a few clips from some of her early films, including the last two that we just spoke about. I'll stop it right there. I know we could keep watching forever. She's so captivating. But you saw some clips from The Toll of the Sea, The Thief of Baghdad. I think you get a sense of what I'm talking about when I talk about her early performances. So following The Thief of Baghdad, she gets a ton of work. She's working in a lot of other films. And so one of the next films she does is actually The Alaskan. And I'm bringing this up because there's a Canada connection. And Hollywood likes to cut corners, so instead of filming on location in Alaska, they decide we'll just film in Canada. It's closer. So Anna May Wong is cast actually as an Inuit character in this film, and they also have another Chinese crew member who is James Wong Howe, Chinese-American cinematographer who later becomes an award-winning, cinematographer. He wins the first Oscar as an Asian American, and they were friends, by the way. Not related. They're both Wongs. They weren't related, but they were friends. So they're both part of this cast and crew. They're traveling up with the production along the West Coast. They're in Seattle, about to board a ship for Canada, when they realize, oh, wait a minute, because we have two Chinese-American crew members, they need papers. So, we're standing in an exhibition about the Chinese exclusion in Canada. The Chinese exclusion era in the US began in 1882. So several decades, many decades actually, prior to when it started in Canada. And essentially, whether you were born here or had some kind of status in or born in the US, had status there as a Chinese person, you needed identity papers and you had to request permission to leave the country in order to come back and prove who you were. So this became a problem for the production. We don't know exactly what happened, but I assume that the studio kind of threw their weight around. They got the paperwork done. The cast and crew were able to leave, they went to Banff actually to film this. And they filmed from the top of the Fairmont Hotel. I have been there. I've since been there because I made it a point to go there to see that. But this is Anna May Wong's first brush with what it means to be Chinese American and to essentially be a second-class citizen. So in Seattle, she's issued her identity papers, which we see here on the left. And you'll say, you can see it says Seattle, Washington, issued August 1924. On the right is actually Form 430, which was the application you had to make every single time you wanted to leave the country. So here she's applying in 1927 to leave. You can have to state the reasons why. It has all of your identifying information. Sometimes it would also note, birthmarks, scars, things like that. And then you'd have to wait to get granted permission. And then upon returning, you'd be submitted to interrogation, which Anna May Wong was, even as a celebrity and a public figure. She still had to answer questions about her identity, what her profession was, where did she live. She'd also be asked questions about family members. They'd hold up photographs. Can you tell me who this person is? And sometimes, actually, in one of her files, there was a case where someone else was pretending to be her brother, and she had to kind of explain that whole situation. So this is a very humbling, I think, moment for her, and one of the hardships and things that sets her apart from other people in Hollywood. She's having to deal with what it means to be Chinese. So during this period, like I mentioned, she's getting a lot of work, but a lot of times they're bit parts, or she's getting pigeonholed as kind of, slinky floozies, or, evil, helpers. Sometimes she's just a innocuous Chinese maiden in the background. But as you see here, the Chinese parrot, that was actually an early Charlie Chan film. They're using Anna May Wong's image to advertise the film, but she's only in the film in the very beginning and gets killed off almost immediately. So this was a pattern. She kept getting killed off in these films, or she'd be the number two girl, as we see here with Renee Adderey in this publicity still. Renee is playing the lead in Yellowface alongside Lon Chaney, also in Yellowface in a film called Mr. Wu. Meanwhile, Anna May is teaching her how to read Chinese and teaching her how to use chopsticks. So this became a especially frustrating experience for her. And part of the reason that Hollywood studios claimed they wouldn't cast her in leading roles was because they were now under a lot of pressure from the US government to no longer have these kind of racy stories of interracial love, as you saw in The Toll of the Sea. So they're trying to clean up their act. They basically say, sorry, Anna May, we can't cast you opposite a white leading male because that would be interracial love. Also, even if we did do that, you couldn't have a happy ending. You'd have to die. So she's extremely frustrated, and I think this quote from an interview she did around this time really expresses the issues that she's facing. She says, to tell the truth, I'm Chinese by race, and I love Chinese people and things. My only regret is the limitation upon my work, as I can only play Oriental roles or sometimes Indian parts. Hayakawa's stardom failed because he was never allowed to kiss the heroine. The fans wouldn't have stood for it. And here she's referring to Sesu Hayakawa, who is a Japanese actor who had been extremely successful in early Hollywood, was one of the biggest stars in the world, but ultimately left in part because of this reason. And then, her interviewer says, but surely no one objects to seeing an American kiss a pretty little Chinese girl. And she responds, not if she is impersonated by an American in yellowface. But she hasn't given up hope. She says, someday someone will write a story demanding a real Chinese girl. Then perhaps I'll have my chance. So you can see she's definitely resilient despite the frustration she's experiencing. So around this time, she's also hanging around with a lot of British and German expats who are working in Hollywood, kind of a more sophisticated circle of people. And she gets an offer to make a film in Germany at UFA, the premier film studio in Berlin. So she's 23 at this point. The farthest away she's ever been from home is Canada. She doesn't speak a word of German, and she's asked a lot of people what they think. What should she do? Should she go? And many people advise her not to leave Hollywood, because you leave, you won't have a career when you come back. So what does she do? May Wong decides to go, because she is a very risk-taking type of person. She bets on herself, and she knows that she has talent, and this is her opportunity. So in 1928, she leaves with her older sister Lulu. You see them here en route on their journey to Berlin. She arrives in Germany. People really embrace her. There isn't the same kind of racism, racial hierarchy that there is in the US. There's almost no Chinese people in Germany. So they're really fascinated by her. Like, who is this exotic creature? So they embrace her. She's very happy. And part of the reason she's happy is because they're making her the star of this film. She doesn't have to fight with anyone else for screen time. And so the first film she makes is called Song. It's actually retitled Song in homage to her Chinese name, Wong Liu Song. And she's starring opposite Heinrich George, who is a German actor. He'd recently been in Metropolis. And it's a really beautiful, it's melodramatic, but it's a beautifully shot film, kind of captures the best of German expressionism in that era. And it premieres in Berlin in the summer of 1928 to a standing ovation. Supposedly they stood for 20 minutes, heralding her triumph. She said it was an out-of-body experience. And so this is kind of the trend that continues across the continent for almost 3 years. She makes a number of films in Germany, some shot in France. She also goes to England and makes a film called Piccadilly. And so you can see here through all the press she's getting in England, in Germany, there's some in France as well. Her arrival is also inspiring people to wear Chinese, shawls, to wear silk pajama sets. She's kind of setting the trend. She's all the rage, and all the photographers and artists are lining up to capture her portrait. So it's a really heady time for her. She makes her debut in the theater on the West End in London, and around the 3-year mark, Hollywood starts to realize maybe we made a mistake. Maybe we messed up. And Anna May, she actually receives an offer during this time to make some kind of film, and she very shrewdly has her response to the offer published in the Los Angeles Times. And she writes to them very politely saying, "Oh, thank you so much for your offer, but I don't think I'll be home before Christmas. I just debuted in this film Song. I had a standing ovation. I'm making my debut on the theater in the London West End, and et cetera, et cetera." So you kind of get the picture. She is saying thanks, but no thanks. But by the time she does finally make it back to the States, she lands in New York, and she's fresh off I didn't intend a pun, but she is fresh off the boat. And a Broadway producer accosts her, and he wants her to be in a play that's opening in 2 weeks called On the Spot. It's about a Chicago gangsterland story, and the Chicago gangster has a girlfriend who's Chinese. So she agrees to do it. She has 2 weeks to learn her part. She opens on Broadway. It's a huge hit. They end up doing the play in New York for 5 months, and then she travels it across the country. By the time she finally makes it to Hollywood in the summer of 1931, Paramount has finally given her a 2-picture deal, and the first of those pictures is a starring vehicle for her specifically called Daughter of the Dragon. Now, it is limited by Hollywood's imagination because it's a Fu Manchu story. So they're going back to the same old stereotypes, and this is really like the literal dragon lady part. Like there's no more of a dragon lady part than this one. She's the daughter of Fu Manchu, out to avenge him, out to get blood. So the script is really hokey. It's campy in a bad way. They do bring back Setsu Hayakawa to be her co-star. Warner Oland is also in it, playing her father, Fu Manchu, in Yellowface. So they spent a lot of money on it. I mean, one of the few bright spots is the fact that Travis Banton designed all the costumes for her, and so they're really fabulous costumes, and there's a lot of them, so it's worth watching for that reason alone. But it's not a great movie. It didn't do well at the box office. But here also you see one of the publicity stills that she signed Orientally Yours, May Wong. So it's kind of her way of winking at people. She understood that what set her apart was her Asian identity, her Chineseness. So she always found ways to play it up that benefited her. So during this time, she makes Daughter of the Dragon. It's not a hit. She does another film called Shanghai Express, which is a great film, but it's really a starring vehicle for Marlene Dietrich, not May Wong. So after that film, she doesn't get her contract renewed. And it's a really rough time for her. So you kind of see the beginning of the ups and downs of her career, which will really continue throughout her life. But 1932 was surprisingly a busy year for China-themed films in Hollywood. There were a lot of them because there was a conflict in Asia going on between Japan and China at the time. But May Wong doesn't get a role in any of them. Most of the parts go to white actors in Yellowface. And she writes about the frustrations here to her friend Carl Van Vechten in this letter. She says, "I made a test at MGM Studios for the leading role in The Sun Daughter. I guess I look too Chinese to play a Chinese because I hear Colleen Moore is going to do it." In the end, Helen Hayes played the part, which is who you see pictured here, and her friend, Mexican actor Ramon Navarro, plays the male lead. Around this time, related to these China-themed projects, there's a novel called The Good Earth, which many of you have probably heard of, maybe you've read it, that's published in 1931 by Pearl S. Buck, who's the daughter of American missionaries in China. She grows up in China, speaks Chinese fluently, has a really deep understanding of the culture, and writes this sympathetic novel about 2 Chinese peasant farmers, Wang Lang and Olan. And so when American readers get their hands on this book, they're so startled by the fact that the characters seem so relatable that they don't even remember that they're Chinese. It's so humanizing. So it's a surprising bestseller. It wins the Pulitzer. It's a big deal in almost everyone in America or someone has read this book at that time. So Irving Thalberg, the boy wonder at MGM, decides that he's going to take The Good Earth and make it into an epic film. And he pays a lot of money for the film rights. So now we can recall the thing that May Wong had earlier said in that interview. Someday, someone will write a story demanding a real Chinese girl. Then perhaps I'll have my chance. So you would think this is the moment she's been waiting for in her career. And everyone in the press, she has a lot of friends in the media, they're all dropping hints about it. Who do you think should play the female lead? Well, shouldn't it be May Wong? She's the only Chinese actress that we can think of. So this goes on for a while. Of course, in the end, they don't cast her in the lead role. Instead, they cast 2 European actors. The first is Paul Muni, so they cast him as Wang Lang, and they use that as a pretense to again say to May, sorry, we can't have an Asian in the female lead because the male lead's being played by a white actor, even though he's supposed to be Chinese. So, there's the illogic of that statement. And then Louise Reiner is cast in the female lead. She's a German actress. She's really only been in Hollywood for about a year or so. She's still learning English, but that is considered A-okay for her to play this role. Meanwhile, all the other Chinese actors, Chinese American actors are auditioning either sound too American or not Chinese enough, or too Chinese and not, fluent enough. But, MGM is convinced that they're going to do this really authentic, sympathetic portrait of the Chinese. They sent scouts to China to basically buy up farms so they can use them as props. They've studied the customs, the hair, the dress, all of these things. They're even advertising, as you see here, how realistic their yellow face makeup is. They're really making an effort, but they can't bring themselves to cast Asian actors in the principal roles. So at one point, they do ask Anna May to come in and audition for a supporting role, which she does. Ultimately, she decides, I'm not going to be in this film. And instead, she makes a statement. She says, I'm going to China for the first time in my life. And if you want to see what China is really like, you can come with me. So she orchestrates this counter narrative about what it means to be Chinese, Chinese American, what is China. She pens a series of articles chronicling her travels for the New York Herald Tribune, which are then syndicated across the US. She also has a cameraman come with her who documents some of her travels, which are sent home as newsreels, and she also later puts that into a documentary that she narrates. And so while she's in China, we see her here arriving in Shanghai on the far left, also visiting one of the beautiful walled gardens of Beijing, which was, I think, her favorite place in China. She really loved the gardens there, and she later builds a home for herself in Santa Monica with a moon gate, and she names the home Moon Gate. You also see her in the bottom right corner. This is actually one of my favorite photos of her. She's out in the countryside speaking with real Chinese farmers rather than, these kind of made up people that Hollywood is creating. So she's really connecting in a deep way with her culture, trying to understand her roots, where she came from, because for so long, people have been associating her with China, but she's never been there. So there's this, kind of divorce between the two things. And so it's a life-changing experience for her. I write a lot about her travels in China as well as The Good Earth in my book, because for me, it was really like a split screen moment where you could see the two different versions of China, the one that she goes to in real life and the one that Hollywood fabricates, and then the hypocrisies that generates. So she has this life-changing experience, returns to Hollywood, and because she's been in China, people have actually criticized her quite a bit about her early films. And they've asked, why did you play all those roles that make us look bad? You weren't wearing any clothes. Some of her films have even been banned in China, so people haven't even seen them. So she gets a lot of criticism, but she takes it to heart. So when she returns to the US, she says very publicly, I'm no longer going to play any unsympathetic roles that reflect badly on my people. And what's more, she says, Hollywood won't cast Chinese actors in Chinese roles. And that's her way of saying Hollywood is racist. And I think that was a really courageous thing for her to do in the 1930s. I can't think of anyone else who was speaking publicly about that type of thing. And the incredible thing is that it doesn't get her blacklisted. Instead, she's able to turn it into a new deal for herself at Paramount. So one of the other things she learned from her travels, because she runs into Warner Oland, the Swedish actor who plays Charlie Chan, while he's in China, and he's embraced by the Chinese people. They love him because they love Charlie Chan. He's a positive role model. So she goes to Paramount and says, why can't I play a female version of Charlie Chan, who's a heroine? So they don't exactly give her a detective series, but they do give her a series of B movies, lower budgets, but she has more influence over the stories. And the first of these is Daughter of Shanghai in 1937 with Philip Ahn, Korean-American actor, who was actually a childhood friend of hers. And they are the starring heroes of this film. Philip Ahn actually plays an FBI agent, which someone recently noted predates an actual Asian American becoming an FBI agent. So in that sense, this film is really visionary. And then she flips the script by having all the villains played by white actors. And instead of being killed off in the end, she gets her happy ending. Her and the Philip Ahn character live happily ever after. They get married in this romantic scene at the back of a car. So really radical thing to be doing in 1937. Another one of these films I like to point out from this period is King of Chinatown, 1939, which is a fictional biopic of Dr. Margaret Chung, who's the first Chinese-American woman to become a doctor. She was also really involved with the Flying Tigers, which was pilots who were, I think, sending aid or they were involved in World War II effort. And Anna May Wong and her were personal friends, so it was very, very much a tribute to her. But the reason I like this film is because it has a lot of little slices of life of Chinese America. She's playing a modern surgeon, but her father runs a Chinese herbal shop. During Chinese New Year, she invites her colleagues at the hospital home to have Chinese New Year dinner with her family. So these are, that kind of thing, you didn't really see that in films in the 1930s. So I think, again, that's really radical that she's putting this in her films. So definitely a good one to check out. And so this is really, the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more that happens in her life after this point that we're not going to get to tonight, but you can kind of get a sense of the ups and the downs, and just how resilient and determined she was. So before I close, I just want to go over some of the accomplishments she made in her career. She was the first woman of color to play a leading role in a Hollywood production, which was The Toll of the Sea. She was the first Chinese American, first Asian American movie star. She is possibly cinema's first interracial kiss in a British film called Javahead, which was made in 1934. It's basically like an earlier version of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner when you watch it. It's kind of funny. The first time I saw it, I was like, oh my God, that's what this is. And then her and Philip Ahn became the first Asian American actors to play a leading romantic couple in the sound era. And the photograph here is actually a behind-the-scenes photograph from a television series that she created in the 1950s called The Gallery of Madame Liu Song, which was about a woman who owned an art gallery and traveled around the world solving art crimes. Unfortunately, the tapes are lost, but it did make her the first Asian American to star in a television show. She died relatively young at age 56 in 1961, but when you look at the credits to her name, the things that she did, it's really remarkable. So that is Anna May Wong. We'll talk a little bit more about the book, which I'm happy to sign copies if anyone has one. I also write a newsletter called Half Caste Woman, where you can learn more about some of the research that didn't go into the book that I put on there as deep dives. And I'm also on social media. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Katie. That was super. First thing I want to say is that this is a marvelous biography, an absolute page-turner. I thought I knew her. I had a sense of the kind of vision of Anna May Wong, but I realized that I really didn't have enough of the details, and I was surprised on almost every page by the stories that you told. So I wondered if we could start by your telling us how you got hooked on Anna May Wong.
Sure. So I first learned about Anna May Wong 20 years ago when I was doing my first college internship at the Chinese American Museum in Los Angeles, which underscores just how important institutions like this one and many others are, because this is where we learn our own history when it's not taught in school. So I showed up to this internship. The curator was giving me a tour of one of the exhibitions, which had black and white photographs of Chinatown, and there was a photograph of Anna May Wong. I didn't know who she was, but I immediately wanted to know. And when I learned that she was this movie star from the 1920s, I couldn't believe it. I grew up in the 90s, and I could count on one hand the Asian American role models that I had. It was Margaret Cho, B.D. Wong in Law and Order, and Michelle Kwan, the Olympic figure skater. That was it. Those were the only people I could think of. So I was like, Anna May Wong existed, 100 years ago? How is that possible? And then, how is it possible that no one ever told me about her? And then I went home and asked my mom, do you know who this is? And she's like, not really. And I kept asking people, and nobody seemed to know who she was anymore. And so I was like, this is not right. This woman, was a pioneer in early Hollywood. I want to know who she is, and other people need to know who she was. So that just set me on this journey, and I really couldn't rest until I wrote this book.
That's dedication. I'm curious in the audience, how many of you had any preconception of Anna May Wong before you came? Anyone see any of her films or Yeah, I feel like some people have and some people haven't. So she's sort of interesting that way, where she's familiar to people. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your title, because it seems to anticipate that some of us, but also some of her peers, had preconceptions about her. So how did that come about?
So, I mean, the China doll is such a ubiquitous stereotype that I think, especially during COVID, a lot of Asian women have related to. And I actually went to like an anti or a stop, Asian hate rally in New York during the pandemic, and a woman had, and this is after I had already titled my book. She had a sign that said, "Not your China doll." And so in a sense, it is kind of a rallying cry, but the idea for it, so there's a Raoul Peck documentary about James Baldwin called "I'm Not Your Negro," which was something that James Baldwin said. So that phrase was stuck in my head, and I was like, how could I use that for Anna May Wong? Like, what's the defining stereotype? Because a lot of people still to this day will dismiss her as, oh, she just played those stereotypes to make us look bad. And she really is much more than that, way more than that. She's nothing like the stereotypical China doll at all. So I wanted there to be a sense of defiance, but also that she herself had agency over her own image and who she was and her career, which is absolutely true, as you could see from, the presentation, all the things that she did. But I think the interesting thing that has been that after the book has come out, I feel like so many Asian women have come to me and said, wow, I really related to her experience. I mean, unfortunately, I really related to her experience. Things haven't changed, and I'm tired of being perceived this way. So it is really a persistent stereotype.
Yeah, I think her agency comes through so well in the way you tell the story and the details that you pull out. So there's no question she's facing challenges at every turn, but she's creative enough to find ways to navigate some of those limitations. So that was really great. I feel like in many ways, this book is about way more than Anna May Wong, and in a way, recovering her story and documenting her life is a way for you to kind of explain a trajectory that we're living in the aftermath of now, I guess, just like 100 years of Asians being in Hollywood, not being in Hollywood. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about how Anna May Wong leads to, say, Michelle Yeoh.
Yeah, so, well, there's so much to say there. I mean, maybe where I'll start is that one of the surprises for me, or I think there was this idea out there in the ether that I adopted that was assumed that there weren't Asians in early Hollywood. And that's why we weren't there, until very recently. Like, oh, we just weren't there. And so that's why we're not there now. And it just takes time, et cetera, et cetera. But, looking at Anna May Wong's life, well, she was obviously there. Then you start to learn, oh, there were all these other people too. There's James Wong Howe, there's Moon Kwan, there's James B. Leong, there's Kamiyama Sojin, Setsu Hayakawa. I mean, I could go on. There's actually a long list of Asians working in Hollywood during this period, and either they slowly get pushed out, like Setsu Hayakawa leaves, or they realized there aren't any opportunities for them. They stopped trying, right? And so there's a reason that they're not there. And so then, fast forward to someone like Michelle Yeoh, I mean, it's incredible to see her and someone like her finally get acknowledged for her work. But at the same time, you have to ask, well, why did it take this long? Because it's not like we just showed up. And, some of the same things that Anna May Wong went through still hold true today, like producers not wanting to greenlight stories because they don't think, Asians are box office, that they're not going to sell. I mean, Crazy Rich Asians has proved that wrong, but we're still stuck in a certain mindset that says, well, it has to be, a certain type of production, like an all Asian cast and specifically Asian story. We're not going to cast, an Asian actress as Wonder Woman, something like that. So we're still stuck in a certain type of pigeonhole, although it's broadened. But yeah, so I think there are so many comparisons to draw from her career to what's going on to today, because it really, in many ways, hasn't changed. I mean, it's changed incrementally.
Yeah, I think it's really tempting to think about history as a progress narrative, right? So, it was so bad then, and hooray, Michelle Yeoh, she's won an Oscar. But I think the deep dive that you do into the archive really shows how from the 20s to the 30s is really a strange, uneven time. Like when you point out that the Technicolor film, she could have a leading role in that. And then a few years later, sorry, we're not going to let you kiss a white character we're not even going to let you kiss a Chinese man being played by. So it's really uneven. And do you feel like that was another one of the challenges for her, just that the rules kept changing between silent and talkie, and between before the Hays Code and after? Maybe you could tell people a little bit about the Hays Code, because I think that's kind of a deal breaker for a lot of Asians in Hollywood for a while,
yes.
Right?
Yeah, so there's oftentimes people talk about pre-code films or post, Hays Code, after the Hays Code. So what happens during the 1920s is the early films are very racy. You have Setsu Hayakawa in The Cheat, which is his breakout role, which is, essentially like a rape fantasy. I mean, that's what I would call it. You have all of these films that are dealing with, you have The Sheik, Valentino is playing a sheik. So you have all of these kind of interracial fantasies going on, but that kind of ends in the early to mid 1920s because there's been a number of scandals. I can't remember the name, but there's an actor who gets murdered, and then there's a whole scandal with Fatty Arbuckle, and so Hollywood is under pressure from the U.S. government to clean up its act. So they can't really indulge in these types of narratives anymore, which is partly the reason. And then they have Will Hays come along to create a motion picture production code, basically a set of moral criteria for what should be in films. And one of those stipulations is no miscegenation, which means, interracial relationships. I mean, it's also illegal in the United States at that time to marry another person of a different race. Mm-hmm. So the rules get stricter. I think it also has to do with how the industry is developing. And yes, there's all of these medium changes, which anime is able to navigate actually quite well. She's able to make the jump from silence to talkies, to do theater, to do radio. But the issue really is that when Hollywood started, it was this rough and tumble industry. Nobody knew what it was. You had all these creative, kind of crazy people just doing whatever they wanted. And slowly, and you had a lot more women too, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of women writers, directors, they also are pushed out. So the industry consolidates, and you have all these people with money come in, men with money come in, and they're the ones who start to change things. And so, yeah, the 1930s is actually not a great time for film, and there's actually a film adaptation of the play that she does on Broadway, and it's terrible because at that point they can't even talk about gangsters in a film because that's a bad influence on people. If you have gangsters, robbing people, and she's no longer the guy's girlfriend because, she can't be his girlfriend, so she becomes his hostess who just lives in his home. I mean, that doesn't make any sense.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about the shift from the silent to the talkies. So, if you've seen Singing in the Rain, you'll remember that there's this scene where a starlet has been in the silent films, and then she shifts over and she has such a strong accent. I think she says, "I can't stand it." And then they think, oh, forget it, she can't be the leading lady. So one thing that really surprised me reading about Anna May Wong was how she talked. You kind of captured how she talked. So none of the clips conveyed that. So I wondered if you could just tell us more about her sound.
Sure. Yeah, so you all saw silent film clips of her. So for a long time, many people didn't know what she sounded like, which again furthered the impression that she was from China, right? She's Chinese. So when she gets to Europe and makes her stage debut in London, I don't know what people were expecting, but she's in this play that's supposed to be a Chinese play. It's been translated into German and then translated into English and then adapted and changed, and so it's supposedly a Chinese play. So she's the lead in this play, actually with a young Laurence Olivier, and so most of the cast, other than one other Chinese actress, they're all British actors in yellowface, playing Chinese. And the critics, they talk about how beautiful she is, her skin like porcelain, et cetera, but they can't stand her voice because she has this terrible American accent. It's awful. And then and because of that, she doesn't seem Chinese. And it's never really explained what she should sound like if she's Chinese. I don't know what the answer to that is. But I mean, it's incredible and I quote a lot of the reviews because they're so absurd. They all say the same thing. So you can imagine her just thinking what, this is crazy. But again, she takes the criticism in stride, and she actually hires someone to give her British elocution lessons. So apparently she loses her American twang before she moves into sound film. So when we hear her in sound, she has a slight British tinged accent, especially if you watch Shanghai Express. That's a good example of it. But she has a very low, mellow voice. I think a lot of people assume she'd have a high squeaky voice or something like that, or talk like a cartoon. But she has a very low, deep voice. So I think that surprises a lot of people. But, just going back to the whole criticism of her American accent, she, at the end of her run in the West End, they have this kind of press luncheon. And I think they're all talking about the controversy, or asking questions of her. And she answers all of them and finally says, "And now I will say something in a language that none of you can understand." And then she rattles something off in Cantonese. So that was her sense of humor, throwing it back in their face.
Yeah. I was thinking, in addition to the fact that she was born in Southern California and had that accent, I was also just thinking about her embrace of slang and her cheeky, witty, the lines that you quote from interviews and other examples of her spoken speech, they really make her come alive as a kind of a dynamo. So were you surprised by that yourself when you encountered what you had seen as a still photo, right, come to life in these vocal samples?
Yeah, I think reading a lot of her early interviews, she's very unfiltered. She's a teenager, so she's kind of saying whatever is coming to mind. You see a lot of interesting, she's becoming friends actually with some of the young reporters who are interviewing you, who are also young women. They go driving cars, and that's what flappers did. They like to drive in fast cars. So you really get that joie de vivre from her. But then, her tone evolves over time. But I think one of the things that still really impresses me is that she wrote a lot of pieces. She wrote some memoir pieces in her early career. She wrote about her travels in China, gave a lot of interviews that sound as if she wrote them. And her voice is so clear. She has such a clear personality, and the way she speaks, it's so confident and knowing. And if you read other interviews of Hollywood actresses from that period, they don't have anything to say. They're not like her at all. She was very well read. She never graduated high school, but she was a reader. She really loved and admired writers and artists and intellectuals. So she was very, polished in that way.
Yeah. And it really comes across in the chapters when she's in Germany, because the people she's hanging out with in Germany are expressionist filmmakers, philosophers, people who have a rich intellectual life, and she's not left behind by them. She is as engaging to them as they are to her, I guess I'd say. Is that accurate?
Yes, I mean, well, we talked about this earlier today. She, when she's in Berlin, she goes to this private party where she meets the philosopher Walter Benjamin, and he's completely smitten with her. He actually wants her all to himself. He's like, "Can we go to the other room so I can speak to you directly?" And he basically interviews her. He has all these questions about, what's your background? How did you grow up? When did your family immigrate? What do you think about this actor? And how do you do your craft? And all of these things. And so he's so fascinated with her that he writes up this whole article about their interview and has it published in the newspaper. I mean, a philosopher. So you can, and there's actually a bit too where he talks about how she lets her hair down, and you can tell that he's really thrilled by that. So he, was completely, charmed by her. And so I think it's really incredible to see someone as important, such an important thinker at that time, to, kind of be brought to his knees by Anna May Wong.
Yeah, that was a powerful scene. Okay, I feel like I'm going to ask one more question. I've been keeping track. I think I'm okay with this. I guess I just have a feeling that even though this is not a thin book, there has to be something that it just killed you to leave out. Anything that you wish, or maybe something you discovered later that you wish you could have squeezed in?
Well, there are things that I don't know that I would like to know. I wanted to know more about her friendship with Paul Robeson, a Black American actor. I would have loved to have seen her love letters, her private correspondence. Don't have that. There's one big thing I did have to leave out, which is really more of a personal settling scores, essentially, was that my alma mater is Stanford, and Leland Stanford became wealthy off the backs of Chinese labor, which built the Transcontinental Railroad, which he was like the president of that company. And you don't really learn any of that history even when you're a Stanford student. Stanford also, because he was so insanely wealthy, he owned 800 racehorses, which was like his hobby. And because supposedly, this is an apocryphal story, nobody knows the real origins, but supposedly there was a bet among friends asking, when a racehorse is at top speed, do all 4 feet leave the ground? And at that time, we didn't have the photographic technology to stop time at a second. So Stanford then funds Edward Muybridge, who essentially helps invent motion pictures, unintentionally, because he's doing these motion studies. And I thought, well, isn't that ironic that this man who made his money because of the Chinese is then, investing essentially in a technology that allows Anna May Wong to become a star. And so I had this whole, little it's like a loop. And, also Anna May Wong's dad was born in a mining town in Northern California, and although they did not overlap in time, Leland Stanford at one time was the justice of the peace in that town. And so and then also because, her father definitely felt all the racial tensions as a result of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, which is how we get to the Chinese exclusion in 1882. Anyways, so there are all these connections that only I could see. And also I was like, I'm going to stick it to Leland Stanford. And my editor was like, this doesn't make sense. We have to take this out.
Well, it probably would need time to kind of flesh out that story. Yeah, I totally get that. Okay, so I want to open the floor to you guys. Where's Rosalie? Am I supposed to hand the mic to people in the audience as they ask a question, or do you want to do that? Okay, so questions?
Hi, thank you for such a wonderful presentation. It was just amazing just to learn more about Anna May Wong. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about your research process of where you went to find, all this amazing information and nuggets and things.
Yeah, so I went to a lot of different places. Anna May Wong doesn't have personal papers that were saved by her family. Where I did start was some of the only known correspondence, which was between her and her friend Carl Van Vechten, which was at Yale. So that was actually one of the first things I did was go there, because I think the correspondence covers almost 40, maybe 30 years. So it's pretty extensive. So that was the first stop. I actually started writing the book or working on the book during the pandemic, so I was limited in terms of being able to go out into the world. But luckily, a lot of resources have been digitized. So there's the media history, like lantern.org. I don't know if you've used that, but it's a great database of movie magazines, and they're international as well. So that was a huge resource. There's also, digitized newspaper databases. Newspapers.com. I love newspapers.com. There's that one, but there's a ton of other ones. The British newspapers archive as well. And then a bunch of, there are a lot of things that are online and free in Europe. So French movie magazines, German publications, is able to find a lot of things online. I also started reading biographies and memoirs of her contemporaries in Hollywood to really, because I wanted to get like a lay of the land, because she's really at the beginning of this thing happening. She's there when it starts. And I wanted to know, what did she kind of drop herself into, like when she gets to The Thief of Bagdad, right? That's a huge $1 million production, which is a big deal at the time. So I started there, and then once things opened up again, I started making archival visits. I had to go to London to watch some of her European films, because until recently, most of them hadn't been digitized. New York Public Library has some materials there, including her collection of playbills, which she donated, which are cool to see because they're from all over, from the US, from Europe. Sometimes they have autographs in them if she went backstage to talk to different people who were in the show. What else? I spent a month at the Academy Library in Beverly Hills, going through files related to her and all of the films that she was in, but I also went through related films. Like I went through all the files for The Good Earth. I went through files for Flower Drum Song, which was a film she was supposed to be in but she died before rehearsals began. There's an archive at Berkeley of Chinese movie magazines, and I could kind of go on. There's like endless amounts of things that are out there. And I also tapped into the fan base that exists, because they're also like internet sleuths, and they find a lot of things, or they have their own personal collections. So people have shared things with me. And then there were actually several people still alive who actually knew her in their lifetime. So I was able to correspond or do interviews with them. So yeah, it's kind of, you're kind of just scouring all sorts of things.
So United States and Germany are both considered Western countries, but what would you say was the biggest reason why Anna May Wong was perceived so differently in Germany compared to the United States? Mm-hmm.
So the simple answer is that America was just very racist at that time. It was everything in public life was according to a kind of racial, social class hierarchy. There were rules about, unspoken rules about who could go where, speak to whom, how you spoke to them, right? One of the reasons I have Paul Robeson in the book, they were friends, and I don't know a ton about their friendship, but one of the reasons I kept him in the book and really wanted to tell part of his story was to also have another example of what it was like to be Black during that period, and how difficult, Anna May Wong faced challenges. He faced even worse challenges. So for example, when he was doing a play in Greenwich Village in New York, there was nowhere where he could go out and eat at a restaurant. He'd have to go up to Harlem. Maybe there was some place in Times Square. He would not be served. And so you can't, how do you live like that, right? You can't even have the dignity of most human beings. So then you start to understand why they would want to go to Europe, where they hadn't been exposed to immigration or many people of different races. And so it was not that there wasn't racism there, but it was a different side of that. They were fascinated by these exotic people who were actually American, but they were more interested in them for their kind of racial, ethnic backgrounds, right? Like Josephine Baker, right, with her banana skirt, right? I mean, she's not actually from, I mean, she was from America. She wasn't, straight from Africa. And there was also, an interest in primitivism at that time, thinking of the kind of, beautiful savage. I mean, so it's a different type of fascination, but at least there was an openness and an embrace of these types of figures, unlike in the US, where it was essentially hatred, disgust, a sense that your place is at the bottom of society, so you do not deserve to, be in these types of roles or positions.
How has writing this book connected you to your own ancestry or heritage?
Thank you. That's such a great question. So I think that's one of the reasons why Anna May Wong really spoke to me. Her family is from Toisan in southern China. My mother's family is also from there. She was a third generation Chinese American. At this point, I would consider myself fifth generation. We don't, my mom grew up in Los Angeles, in Chinatown. She knows some Cantonese or Toisanese, but she doesn't really speak the language, doesn't understand the customs. That's what it means to be kind of this hyphenated American or Chinese Canadian. You're, in a sense, divorced from the original culture and always trying to figure out what the real essence of it is. And so I definitely related to that. The fact that she grew up in Los Angeles, she reminded me, and I write about this in the introduction to the book, I think I also saw a lot of my own mother in her, who was, very much a rebel and an independent spirit, never wanted to do what her parents told her to do, which is very much Anna May Wong. They didn't want her to be in the movies, but she did it anyways. So I just saw all those parallels. And so, in a way, writing the book about her was also a way of understanding my own history. And I think one of the moments that really captured that for me was when I went to the UCLA Film and Television Archive, which has the documentary that she made about her travels in China. So she had made this documentary, and then it later aired on ABC in the 1950s, and she narrated it. And so watching it, there's a scene where she finally goes to her father's ancestral village, and they're walking arm in arm. And I had only a couple of years before that gone to my grandma's ancestral village. And it was like, even just thinking about it brings some tears to my eyes, because it's like that was my experience. Like, I know exactly what she was feeling in that moment. And so, and then to feel validated by the fact that, well, look at this famous actress, and that's like, so it's like your life reflected back at you. And I think that's really powerful. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. So, Anna May Wong and I have something in common. In addition to speaking Si Yip Cantonese, we also both grew up in a Chinese laundry. Yeah. So for many years, I kind of followed her career. So my question to you is, given her ascription of growing up in a family laundry in Chinatown, how much did that have on her wanting to reaching the pinnacle of American stardom, you think? That's a tricky question.
Well, I think it definitely instilled a work ethic in her. Like, she was a really hard worker, because she, according to these early interviews, would explain to them how the entire laundry worked, because she'd done almost everything at one point or another. She was also a bookkeeper. So even while she was working, on the set for The Thief of Bagdad, this huge production, she'd come home to the laundry and help out, get back to the bookkeeping, right? So she had 2 shifts in a day. And that was remarked on by Douglas Fairbanks himself, as well as others. So I think it is, her parents technically aren't immigrants, but I think it is that kind of immigrant work ethic, the working class work ethic. Also that sense that you don't have all the answers, but you're going to figure it out regardless. Like, there isn't an option not to, right? Failure is not an option. And so that determination and sense that whatever she did, she was going to figure out a way around it. I think that comes from a lot of probably what she learned in the laundry.
So you had mentioned that her parents didn't want her to go into that. Did that attitude change as she found success?
I think it was always pretty mixed. I mean, she loved her father dearly, but I think that they were very similar, so they butt heads a lot. And both her parents did not want her to be in movies. But that you also have to understand that during that time, nobody wanted their children to be in movies. It was not a reputable business. But her mother also had a kind of superstition that if you have your photograph taken too much, you'll lose your soul, which I think really metaphorically can be true. So her mom worried about that. Her father didn't want her to be around men unchaperoned by herself, which she was, and things did happen. So there were a lot of reasons why they didn't want her to go into the movies, but she did it anyways, and she was successful. So she was bringing home money and contributing to the family. So her father wasn't going to say no to that, right? She's bringing home a lot of money. At one point, I think he asked her, because he had another family in China. He had a first wife and a son there, and that first wife didn't want to come to the U.S. So she was like, "You can marry someone else, and marry a second wife." So at one point, I think he wanted her to start using her money to send back to that family, and I think that's where she put her foot down, because they were always trying to tell them what to do and how to live their lives. But she sent all of her brothers to college. I don't actually have the records, but I believe that she likely owned property that they lived in. So she loved her family deeply, was dedicated to them. So a lot of her resources went back into them. So yes, in that sense, they were happy for her to do those things. I don't know, whether he ever said something like, "I'm proud of you," like that. I doubt it. But there wasn't there was an understanding there. And that's actually one of the reasons I point out that film, King of Chinatown, because there is a father figure in that film, and there's a kind of really loving rapport between the two of them, and they very much, show the two different generations. They're kind of different levels of Americanness, and I think that was her way of it was a nod to her relationship with her own father.
Hi. Yeah, I was wondering about, how Anna May Wong was such a pioneer in her time and seemed to be really well known in her time, and then how you mentioned when you first encountered her, you had the experience of, no one you were talking to knowing about her, and now you've spent, 20 years researching her, you've written this book, which is out now. How do you think she would feel knowing that she's kind of been rediscovered and her story has been elevated and shared by you? Like, how do you think she would feel to see this book?
I mean, I hope she would be proud and happy. I think it sounds maybe weird for me as a biographer to say I feel like a deep connection to her, like maybe spiritually. And I have visited her grave, and every time I visited, so the first time I visited, I took photos of the grave, and it actually was a pretty emotional experience for me. I mean, I didn't expect that to happen, but it was. And I had taken all these photos, and I went home afterwards, and I looked at them, and they had this weird rainbow halo over the grave. And I posted it to Instagram, and I was like, what do you guys think this is? And it's definitely a spirit. So I kind of take that as a sign that this is something she wanted. But I didn't just do this alone. I mean, I think one of the reasons her profile is rising again is partially because what is happening in Hollywood now and media, because we are seeing a bit of a renaissance for Asian American Asian actors in general and Asian stories. So now people are starting to look backwards and say, well, where did we start? Where did this all begin? And then of course there's the U.S. government has put her on quarters. There is an Anna May Wong Barbie doll that sold out in a week. Gemma Chan is working on a biopic. So all of these things are kind of coalescing and lifting her up again. And I hope that we keep her out with us in our memory. But I think one of the reasons that happened is, because who tells the story matters, right? And if you don't have anyone who cares about her legacy, keeping that history alive, then it goes away.